Okay, friends, you guys kept asking about this one, so we're going to do a series of these episodes. Welcome to Old Man Squad Fantasy Basketball, and this is the best players in fantasy basketball for your head-to-head specific league. I am Dan Besbris. You can follow me on Twitter at Dan Besbris. You can also find our network at Old Man Squad, and the nice thing, of course, about that feed is, in addition to getting all the cool stuff that we put out on our network, it'll follow you back, so you get a free follower out of the ordeal. Please remember to hit that like button, subscribe to our stuff, YouTube, iTunes, Spotify, wherever you're listening, watching the show. That's all extraordinarily important. And I should also mention, before we throw the slideshow up on the screen, that we will have an additional one of these shows for Roto. This is a head-to-head draft order board. We will do a Roto top 12 draft order board as well. They are very much not one and the same because a few guys that are punt friendly move up into the discussion on head-to-head that in Roto would set you back a little bit too much. I also have a show that we'll be doing at some point soon where I will list the guys that I think are actually the top 12 per game guys, but that doesn't mean that's the order you draft them. Remember, this draft order is a different discussion. I'm giving you a draft order because part of the discussion is about getting players that you want when you want. So, like, if this was just a head-to-head rank board, you'd see Kawhi Leonard in there. Because, like, Kawhi Leonard's going to be a top 6 fantasy play, and you guys know my hot take this year is that he's going to be even better than that. But you sure as crap are not drafting Kawhi Leonard in any format inside the top 12, not with his injury history. So that's why this is not a rank list. This is a draft order. This is the order I would take guys in the first round of my head-to-head league such that it sets me up in the best possible way to build a head-to-head team. Let's begin. So this is Dan's head-to-head top 12, the first round of a head-to-head board. Remember, this is draft order, not final rank. First pick is Nikola Jokic. You guys know this about me. He's, spoiler alert, also my first pick in Roto. I just think he's still the easiest player in fantasy sports to build around. I know that Victor Wembanyama is going to be a game breaker, but a lot of that game-breaking ability for Wemby is due to the fact that for a center, he's extraordinary at defensive stats. Both steals and blocks, very good for Wemby. Remember, down the stretch last year, he was at 4.5 blocks the last 2 months of the season. He was at 1.5 steals over that stretch. Scoring, rebounding, assists, all decent. Rebounding actually pretty good for Wemby. Decent three-point shooter. He does a lot of guard-friendly stuff in addition to the blocks and the rebounds. What he doesn't do, at least as of yet, and I am making this, I know Jokic is the name that's on the board, but let's honestly just go ahead and put both of the first two guys up there, and we'll talk about him as kind of an aggregate. Wemby gives you this terrific start in rebounds and blocks and steals, and a pretty good start. I think scoring probably comes up in scoring. Threes out of a center is good. Assists are good out of a center as well. But even if there's some incremental improvements in percentages, he's going to be likely a negative in the percentages and definitely turnovers as well. And this isn't a slight on Wemby. As you guys can see, he's my number 2 pick in head-to-head leagues because if you build around Wembanyama and you go into a punt field goal build because he's so bad, for a center, he's bad at field goal percent, you can build a pretty damn powerhouse team in the guard stats and also remain very good in shot blocking, which is kind of a weird bonus you get when you try to do a guard build, or that you don't get when you try to do a guard builder on someone like a Trae Young or something like that. Which, by the way, is a reason to shy away from that build, because if the Wemby team does that, they're coming for you, guard build teams, and they've got a ace in the hole, and that's a dude who's blocking 4 shots a game. But this comes back to the Jokic discussion. Nikola Jokic, let's just say that the point gap between Jokic and Wemby gets wiped out. Wemby wins in threes by a little bit. Jokic they're probably going to be pretty close in rebounding. Nikola dominates him in assists. I don't think that's going anywhere. Steals will probably be relatively tight. Nikola Had a very small edge there last year. Wemby obviously destroys him in blocks. But where Jokic runs away with this one for me is that he's strong in both percentages. One of the best field goal percent by volume guys in the NBA. Solid at the free throw line, particularly for a center, very good at free throws. And then, despite being not great at turnovers, the fact that he's 3-1, you should be looking at assist to turnover ratio, is very good. And Wemby is like 1.25 to 1 last year. So for my money, coming back in the second round, we're always like, oh, it's so hard to find guard stats early on. Those guys dry up so fast. It's so hard to find scoring early on. Those guys dry up so fast. You can find some of those things, but usually it comes with a colossal hit in something else. The nice thing about Jokic is your team can generally absorb that hit. So if you end up taking a low field goal percent guard at somewhere along the way, Jokic's field goal percent covers that up. You can also, with Jokic, you have an opportunity, if you wanted to punt threes or blocks. You do have chances to punt if you want. Thing is, he's not so bad in either one of those things that it completely derails your team. And neither is Wemby to that effect. But again, for a center, Wemby's field goal percent was quite bad. And I guess you could argue that for a center, Jokic's block rate wasn't very good. But he was like right around league average in blocks, which is low for a center, but not game-breakingly bad. You can find another shot blocker out there. And so the beauty of Jokic is you wait around and all of a sudden it comes back to you at pick 23, whatever. Or 24 if you got that first pick and that's where you're taking him, which I am. You can pick anyone there. You can literally pick any player on the board, provided, I mean, you're obviously still targeting good players at the end of the second round, beginning of the third, and your team build will be fine. There's almost nothing you could do where you're just like, well, screwed it up there. Whereas with Wembanyama, as great as he is and as great as he's going to be, there are still some decisions you can make with your second and third round pick that just make it hard for you to build out your team. Not because those picks are bad in any way, but because we kind of know, based on looking at the board right now, and the board will shuffle a bit, but we know generally the players that are going to be available at 24, at 48, at 72, at these junctures that get back to you. And it's so much easier to be able to kind of choose any of them, which is what you can do with Jokic. And that's why I still love him first, because he just makes the rest of your draft, specifically the next 2 to 4 picks, easier. He's a de-stressor. Third pick, I'm still going Luka. Even though I know he doesn't have a good playoff schedule, there's a 2-game week in there that's really annoying. But I still got to go Luka because he's like the poor man's Nikola Jokic. He scores better. Rebounds, assists are relatively tight. Jokic beats him in rebounds. Luka beat Nikola by a small amount of assists. Neither one of them blocks that many shots. They both have decent steals numbers. Luka obviously runs away with 3-pointers, and that, of course, drags his field goal percent down. But, not a foul shooting was actually fairly similar between the two guys. They're both going to be pretty high turnovers. And that's, again, why I like Luka in this third spot, because he makes your next few picks super freaking easy. The difference, I think, between Luka and Jokic from a fantasy standpoint is free throws. Because Jokic is a good foul shooter. He's a positive there at the center spot. Luka was a neutral foul shooter this last year. He finally got himself basically up to doesn't hurt you, which compared to recently, that's better. But for a guard, you usually expect them to be a positive in that. So at some point with Luka, you're probably going to have to take a big man who's bad at it. And that's going to weigh things down a little bit. So for Luka, your immediate punt thought is probably free throw percent. You're going to have trouble dominating the big man categories the way that a team doing a Giannis punt free throw build might. But you can still beat them in other stuff because you get a massive 3-point advantage in this one. Like Luka is a punt free throw build where you're not going to accidentally punt other big man categories, if that makes sense. And with Giannis, you probably do. You probably punt free throw, and then you might also end up punting threes. Yeah. So you lean more into the big man stuff is what I'm saying with Giannis, where with Luka, you don't have to. You can stick with a well-rounded team and just say, you know what, I'm probably not going to be that great at foul shots and kind of half ignore them. But again, he just makes the build for head-to-head so much easier because you can choose to be great at point. He gives you this foundation of points, threes, boards, assists, steals are good from Luka as well. You've got 5 categories where you're really in great shape. And actually, like, your field goal percent is pretty good there. From a guard at 49%, he's basically a net neutral compared to the whole league, and he's a positive compared to most of the guards. I know the next guy on the list is going to be a true positive in field goal percent from the guard spot, but with Luka, you're getting that plus 3-pointers. So I would argue with Luka, you're getting 5 really, really, really good categories to start, or 4 outstanding ones, a 5th one that's very good in steals, a 6th one that's pretty good in field goal percent, and turnovers are going to be bad, and you can choose to punt free throw if you like, but there's just so many things he does well, and that's why Luka gets the nod for me at 3 over Shai, even though Gilgeous-Alexander has the better playoff schedule. I think Shai takes a small step back this year. His teammates are getting better around him, so I think his scoring probably dips. We saw his steals dip as the season went on. Last season, he was 2 for the entire year, but he's only at 1.6 the last 25 games. He is not hyper elite in rebounding or assist. He is very, very good in both percentages, but that's something that's generally more predictable on the Roto side. Now you're like, Dan, you just talked about Nikola Jokic. There's a little bit of a difference between Jokic going almost 60% on 18 shots a game and Shai going 53% on that same general number of shots. And yes, Shai is going to have a much bigger positive impact in free throw percent, but we all know how that one bounces around even more than field goal on a week-to-week basis. So with Shai, you get a really good start in scoring. You likely get a very good start in steals, not entirely set, and you likely get a very good start in free throw percent. So you're getting these 3 elite categories, but then you're getting a whole lot of pretty goods, which is more of a Roto type of build. Now, if you punt threes, that kind of brings you back into the mix. That elevates them a bit. But I'm trying to discuss a lot of these players without locking yourself into a punt before the draft even starts, basically. If you're like, oh, I got Shai, I got to punt threes. Okay, like, fine. Shai punt threes. Is that better than Luka punting nothing? Maybe, probably. But if we're going to look at it that perspective, then we got to say, okay, Jokic punt threes or punt blocks. Wemby punt field goal. Luka punt free throw. Shai punt threes. This is all the stuff we talked about with Adam Stock a couple of days ago. And those are opportunities, and it's part of the calculation of why I have these guys in this particular order, but I don't think you have to do it. There are a couple guys on this list where you have to do it, or it's idiotic to take them at this location. These guys, you don't have to. It'll help, but you don't have to. My number 5, guys, is Anthony Davis. I actually put out a short on that earlier this morning. Again, he's not a guy where you immediately have to punt anything because he's good at all the things you'd expect a big man to be good at. He can score, maybe not. He's not going to be as elite as like a Luka or a Shai or an Embiid, but he can score a decent amount for a center. Rebounds are outstanding. Blocks are outstanding. Field goal percent is outstanding. He is also very good at a couple of stats that are not typical of big men. Outstanding steals. Very good free throw percent over the down the stretch, in particular last year. So he actually got better at that as the season went on. But overall, he was a lot like Jokic. They were both around 81, 82%. So you're getting these bumps like Jokic, actually, in 2 more guard typical categories, steals and free throw percent. Obviously, the big jump between those 2 guys and why Jokic destroys Anthony Davis is the massive gap in assists. AD has the big advantage in blocked shots. Interestingly, the Anthony Davis, Nikola Jokic fantasy discussion, these guys are not that different. Jokic, big gap in assists. AD, big gap in blocks. And you can cover that gap a little bit. So the immediate thought is like, okay, if I get Anthony Davis, I'm basically getting Jokic without the assists. How do I catch up with the Nikola Jokic team? Yeah, you drew the right conclusion. Just punt assists at that point. Or punt threes, although both of those guys are. And so if Jokic team decides to punt threes also, you probably run into the same general department. AD is probably the first guy that's coming off the board where a punt assist is one of the top choices. And I mean, you can look at the board last year, and I get it. Like, this is a lot of big men are gonna jump up. But if you're punting assists, Anthony Davis basically moves right in there. He's now ahead of Nikola Jokic in overall rank. He would have been in a dead heat with Shai last year, and the only person ahead of those guys would have been Joel Embiid. Not that with the 5th pick, you need to necessarily, quote unquote, close the gap, but that does close it. It brings you back into a dead heat with a Jokic team. Of course, now, if the Jokic team decides to punt threes, that's how they gain a little bit of ground, where maybe your AD team, are you going to do both of those? You punt threes and assists, it becomes very hard to get the right number of guards on your club. But, you could end up with, like, the that 4-5 combo here of, if you could go Jalen Williams, DeMar DeRozan, Jimmy Butler, guys like that, those dudes fit that build extremely well. Where you get some assists, but it's not really a target. Like, you're not getting the 8-9 assist guards in there, and you're also punting threes. But then the Jokic team is going to be fighting you for those guys. So just something to think about as you build your team out. And that's why I have AD 5th. 6th on my board is Giannis Antetokounmpo with a punt free throw. And I know that, like, you don't have to do anything. You don't always have to do it. I would strongly suggest that if you're drafting Giannis in the middle of the first round, you should probably just punt free throws. You should probably just do it. You don't have to, but it becomes a little bit a fool's errand, I think, to try to get free throws back in the mix. Now, again, it doesn't mean that everybody you draft has to be awful at foul shooting, because ultimately in there, if you're punting free throws, meaning you're punting the thing that guards are usually good at, it's easy to get caught up in the, oh crap, I drafted a giant team. And then you forget about threes, you forget about assists, you forget about steals, you forget about free throws. You're now looking at a team, and oftentimes points as well, that's strong in boards, blocks, field goal percent, and turnovers. And that's not enough things. So you have to be very careful with this. When I say punt free throw with Giannis, it means, like, just don't worry about it. But you still have to draft guys that do guard stuff. You still might take a guy who happens to be okay at foul shooting. Just understand that it's not really going to fix your issue. You needed, like, multiple good free throw shooters to wipe out Giannis, and that would only still get you back to the midpoint. So that's why you see teams that take Giannis are drafting LeBron in the 2nd round, De'Aaron Fox in the 3rd. They have the same general targets. I actually think Fox is more important than LeBron in that build because of the guard eligibility. But LeBron, from a stat makeup, actually is the guy that teams want there, because he gets assists out of the power forward spot. You want those out of position guard stats, and you're not worried about foul shooting. So LeBron, who also gets you steals, De'Aaron Fox gets you steals and assists, and they both score a bunch. Thinking about the middle round, someone like a Julius Randle fills in on that. RJ Barrett later on, even a Jalen Green later on. But you got to make sure you don't ruin yourself in threes. Again, that's why LeBron and Fox are so important. Those guys combined for 5 3-pointers a game last year, and they combined for whatever it is, like 14 assists per game. So you put those dudes with Giannis, who had 6.5. You still need more, honestly, but at least you're now competitive in these categories. So Giannis, and another reason that Giannis is in the 6 hole is that he is, I think, an easier player to build a head-to-head team around than the guys that are coming up behind him, because you do punt with Giannis, because it shrinks the board, because shrinking the board means less to think and worry about as you work your way through draft night. And so that's why I've got Giannis ahead of this sort of the back-end crop. Number 7 for me is Tyrese Haliburton, and this is where things get a little bit murky. Haliburton is, in my eyes, probably more of an end-of-first-round 9-cat guy. He was number 10 last year. He started in the early first round. He was more like a mid-second rounder down the stretch, and he had that rough time in the middle. And for Haliburton, he's an interesting one because, yes, you get a great assist start. You get a good steals start. You get actually really good percentages for a guard. both field goal and free throw are solid, and he gets you 3-pointers on that run. But then you're like, wait a minute. I feel like I got most of that from Luka Doncic. Haliburton better at free throw shooting than Luka. How do I close the gap with those dudes? And unfortunately, with Haliburton, the answer is punt points, which is, I love punt points on the Roto side, but it is a very complicated punt to pull off in head-to-head. Because you need to make sure that your percentages stay super strong while also getting 3-pointers in the mix, and then also not sacrificing your defensive stats. If you're going the Roto method here, like the week-to-week variance on percentages is not that great of a concern. You know that it'll level out by the end. You take a couple of big men, because if you take some big men that don't blow up your free throw percent, that covers that up, and you'll do that on the head-to-head side. But all of a sudden now, if you have a rough foul shooting week, the whole thing explodes in your face. So if you're punting points with Tyrese Haliburton, you have to make sure that you're getting enough assists and threes and defensive stats, because the rebounds will come. A punt points team, you're going to eventually get a bunch of big men. It just happens because they're low scoring, and so they move up the board. But you got to make sure you get guys like Derek White, super well-rounded dudes. Jalen Williams is a terrific option, even if he ends up scoring 19-ish points a game. You are hunting guards and wings whose value is derived from other categories. But it does elevate someone like a Chris Paul later on, who's probably going to score 9 points a game this year, or a Mike Conley, who's probably going to score 11 points a game this year. These guys actually become super valuable because they have a good assist-to-turnover ratio. They are hopefully not total drags on your percentages. They're getting you assists and steals, the blocks and boards, and that type of stuff is going to come when you get the big men. You guys know me. I love punting points. I think it's super fun. It completely flips the board on its head because, Alex Caruso was a freaking world beater last year in a punt points format. He's number 21. I love that crap. And he's like, oh, Dan, what else does he do for you? Well, 2.7 defensive stats becomes extraordinarily useful along with 2 3-pointers from that guy. Where was Herb Jones last year in punt points? He was 40th. The board is hilarious when you're punting points. Hilarious, friends. I adore it because of how far guys move. And the nice thing is, too, it's confusing for people that are not used to doing it because you can't just, sort by who gets the biggest bump. Or that'll show you guys that score, 2 points a game. You have to look for the guys that are getting, 9 to 13 points a game that people overlook generally. And then you're like, no, that guy, he does it. Brook Lopez doesn't score much. 2.5 blocks a game last year. He ends up as a really, really, really valuable pick. Like we said, Herb Jones. And forget the traditional big men. Those ones are obvious. Everybody knows they move up the board. Tyus Jones got a nice bump with it. We mentioned Mike Conley gets a nice bump with it. Al frickin' Horford, a non-traditional big man. Big bump. Drew Holiday, nice bump in a punt points format. It is basically all of your targets will just sit there for you all draft day long, which is, again, it's hard to get the exact build right, but finding players you like is, in my opinion, the easiest punt on the board because no one else wants them. Everybody else is hyper-focused on going super volume the whole way through, and you're just like, don't need that dude, don't need that dude, don't need that dude. You're just getting efficient dudes. Pick 8 on my board is Jayson Tatum. I want to move on because this isn't a punt points guide. This is my head-to-head top 12. Jayson Tatum is an intriguing one. He is relatively well-rounded from a fantasy standpoint. He was number 15 per game last year. With Kristaps Porzingis out for a long stretch this season, I wouldn't be surprised to see Tatum crawl up towards the end of the first round, like kind of that 11 and 12 neighborhood. He'll be, by all accounts, fine in both defensive stats, neutral, good at scoring threes, excellent rebounder from the forward position, okay assists from the forward spot as well, decent percentages. I think his free throw could be a little bit higher this coming year. His turnovers won't be super high as well. Although, again, as you get towards the back end of this first round, you get into this, do I take the shot on Joel Embiid? Do I lean into this super hard punt guy like a Trae Young, who, by the way, we'll get there, don't worry. But as you heard from Adam Stock a couple days ago, when you're drafting in this range, you start to have to think about how you bring the top 5 or 6 guys back down to you. And with Tatum, the weird answer, shout out to Adam on this one, is punt assist. Because he's decent at it for a forward, but he's not going to game break it for you. And if you punt assist, you don't have to worry about taking a guard in the next round. You can just take scorers and rebounders and guys who get defensive stats and do it on good percentages. And you can kind of, again, flip the board while everybody else is going categorical scarcity and hard playing assists. And look, I love James Harden. He's the, spoiler alert, he's the honorable mention on today's show. But you don't have to worry about that anymore. You just go take a guy who's going to score a ton. Go take someone who's going to do something else. Flip the board. That's what you get to think about in this one. And it brings Jokic back to the pack. It brings Trae Young back to the pack. It brings Luka back to the pack. It brings, freaking even Wemby, because he's got 5 assists out of the center spot, which is harder to find than 5 assists out of the forward spot. And these big monster guys that run away with the league, suddenly they don't come all the way back to Tatum, but it closes the gap. If you punt assist, Jayson Tatum was a lot closer to those top 4 or 5 guys last year than he was beforehand. You don't have to, though, but it is hard to beat those teams if you don't. At pick 9, and this is sort of the general consensus, I'm not doing anything hot takey here. At pick 9 is when I'm finally willing to take a stab at Joel Embiid, even on the head-to-head side, because now you're really getting out of the guys that are both good and safe. And so with Embiid, you don't have to punt anything. He was amazing at basically every category. If you had to, it would be 3-pointers because it's just flat out his weakest category. But he's a big man who gets 1.5. So again, you really don't need to. And if he happens to play 60 games out of the 9 hole as a top 3 per game fantasy dude, then you just roll with it. But this one's not a strategic move. This is if he stays upright, great. If he doesn't, I'm ruined. Trae Young at 10 is the next choice here, if only because he's the last one. He's the last one. He's the last possibility that can be so elite at a couple of things that you can then kind of build your team on it. But the problem, of course, with Trae Young is that he also he's the prototypical head-to-head polar extreme dude who's going to be amazing at assists and probably scoring and very, very good in threes. And he might even be pretty good in steals. We'll see if that holds year over year. And he's going to be very good in free throws, but he's also going to be an absolute dumpster fire in field goal percent, turnovers, and rebounds. And so he doesn't force you to punt all 3 of those things, but damn if it's hard for him to catch up on the rest of these early guys if you don't. But the nice thing about Trae Young is if you are punting, say, if you just did a field goal percent punt, Trae Young becomes a 2nd rounder. If you punt field goal and turnover, he becomes a 1st rounder. And that's kind of how he gets to this point. The problem, of course, is if you're punting both of those things, some of these other guys that were already above him stay above him, I should say. Like a Luka Doncic, if you're punting field goal percent and turnovers, a Luka team should destroy a Trae team. Because you get the same scoring and threes and assists and steals. And, Trae's going to beat him in free throw percent, but Luka is just destroying him in rebounds. He beat him, in threes. He's ahead of him in blocks by a little bit. Like, punting those things with Trae gets you a lot closer to most of the 1st round, but you're not tracking down Luka. And you're not tracking down a healthy Joel Embiid if you're punting those things. You do get a lot closer to Jokic and Shai and Anthony Davis and Haliburton, who you probably pass because of the turnover punt, and you pass guys like Tatum and Steph and KD and all that stuff. But there is a team or 2 out there that has a better starting name for that same build. You just have to outdo them the rest of the way. But again, compared to the guys that are the last few choices here, like number 11, Steph Curry, Steph has other problems. So don't get me wrong. I love Steph Curry. I think he has a little bit of a bounce back year because he shot only 45% last season, and he was at a career low 0.7 steals per game. Those numbers probably come back a little bit. But Steph Curry is an easier player to build around in Roto than he is in head-to-head. It's as simple as that. He has some weak categories, like field goal percent was weak last year, and steals was weak last year. But it wasn't like the Trae Young situation we just talked about, where Trae is such a huge drag in like 2 or 3 categories that you'd just be wise to not deal with it. Whereas with Steph, you're like, well, he's not that big. Like punting steals probably would be the move there. Because punt field goal percent, you don't get as much of a boost in the guard stuff as you'd want if you're going that direction. And Steph is good at scoring, great at threes. He's good at rebounding for a guard, but not great. Assists are fine, but not great. Steals are not great. Blocks are meh. Field goal percent could be better. Free throws was good, but he didn't take that many. So that's pretty good. Solid, but unspectacular. Turnovers not that high. He's a little bit of a tougher player to build around in head-to-head, but I also can't advocate going a different direction because he's still freaking Steph. And this is where I had a real tough issue. I went Kevin Durant at 12, and it was a debate between KD and Harden. And frankly, I wouldn't fault you for going either direction on those two guys. Kevin Durant is more well-rounded, as we've already seen. He was number 12 last year. He probably does a tiny bit less this season, although I think you could see his percentages actually move up for KD. These were not, career best type of percentages seasons. He'd be another guy like Jayson Tatum, similar build, but a little bit better at that build. But for KD, you've got a couple of choices. You could look at punt assist if you wanted to go that Tatum method, or you could actually punt threes, as Adam mentioned a couple days ago. Punting threes moves him kind of back into that group with, he's not catching Shai in that one, but it brings guys like Luka down. It'll bring Trae down. It'll bring Tatum down. It'll obviously Steph. That's a big one. It brings Wemby down, believe it or not, because of the center eligibility. But it boosts Jokic. So that's a problem. Like if you're punting threes and you're Kevin Durant's team, how the hell are you going to run down the Jokic team? Punting assist probably gets you a little closer to some of to like the Jokic Luka crew. But again, like you're never going to catch those guys when you have an end of the first round pick. And this is something that Josh has been talking about a lot and should be a discussion point, is that giant gap between the first pick and the 12th pick. Like there just isn't a whole lot you can do to cover that ground, but trying to figure out what the punts are that get you closer to those top few guys, that's kind of the way to do it. And then with James Harden, who's going to have a really nice year, most likely James Harden becomes kind of a lot like the Trae Young build, but better at shot blocking and rebounding. Not to the extent that you're like, oh yeah, like James Harden, he's going to be a great shot blocking team, but he gets half a blocked shot a game. And Harden got 6 boards his last season in Philly, which I think is a very attainable number here as the number 2 option of the Clippers. Harden probably not going to score as much as a Trae Young, so I guess that's a little bit of a pivot there. But again, for head-to-head, like you can make a decent argument that Harden going Haliburton number. Maybe I should have said he's more like Haliburton without the field goal percent. So maybe you do that. You go the Harden route and you say, all right, I'll punt field goal and I'll try to beat Haliburton at some of these things. You could even punt field goal and points if you don't think Harden gets up to 22 or 23, but I don't know that you necessarily have to do that. And again, like end of the first round, you do what you got to do. So do you go KD? Do you go Harden? Again, I'm kind of okay with either one of them. And that's the head-to-head top 12 for me. Again, this was a discussion of draft order. This, I think, is the way that you can make your life simplest on the head-to-head side. Draft them if you have whatever pick. And again, like if you have the 7th pick and no one's taken Anthony Davis yet, you go Anthony Davis. This is just the order that I would take these guys through the first 13 effectively, because we'll throw Harden on that board. Obviously, you want to be closer to the top. The advantages there are innumerable. I guess we could probably enumerate them, but there are many. And as you work your way towards the deeper part of the first round, you become kind of more and more forced into punting something, whether you want to or not. And that's not necessarily the case on the Roto side. So we'll have a Roto Top 12 draft order show coming up. That'll be the next. We can do that. Is that going to be 2 shows today of the same thing? I haven't made up my mind on that. In any event, thank you so much for watching, everybody. Please, 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 please subscribe to something. iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, however you're taking it in. If you're on the YouTube side, hit that like button. Comment. If you have comments on this, I'd love to chat it through. I'm more than willing to be told I'm wrong. Just be respectful about it. Right now, because we're still 6 weeks away from the season, I can pretty much answer every comment on the YouTube page. I don't know if I'm going to be able to keep that up all year long, or even especially once we get into October. But for now, I can. So keep the comments coming, keep the subscriptions coming, keep the likes coming. And if you have a moment on one of the traditional channels, throw that 5-star review on. That's actually been really good. That's pushed up some numbers lately as well. I've also mentioned that if you're really a fan, the advertising dollars are actually better for non-YouTube ways of taking in the content. So appreciate that too. Follow on Twitter at Dan Vespers. We're going to keep doing a bunch of stuff over there. At Old Man Squad is the network. And I will see you guys for the next one. So long for